Hello everyone, my name is Grantley McCauley and I'm going to present the System Modeler enhancements that are coming in Agile Business Suite 7.0. There are a couple of areas that we'll be covering, so let's get started by looking at the new model objects that have been introduced. To define strings, numbers, booleans, and the other primitive types, you no longer use the class in AB Suite 7.0. Instead, you use the new entity called primitive. On upgrades to AB Suite 7.0, all of your primitive classes will be converted over to the new primitive type automatically. In addition to user models being converted to the new primitive entity, the AB Suite framework has also been modified. The framework is a collection of types and classes that we use to build up the GLB object, as well as allowing you to create things such as the output stream. If you look on the right hand side, you'll see 6.1 next to 7.0, and you can see the account month as a good example of being represented as a class in 6.1 and now being represented as our new primitive entity. For MCP configurations, we used to have the binary primitive type. Now in AB Suite 7.0, we represent binary files using our new framework class called binary file that you associate your attribute, variable or parameter to. On upgrade to AB Suite 7.0, all binary primitive types will be automatically converted to template to the binary file class. One class you won't see in the framework is file. In previous versions of AB Suite, you would inherit from glb.file. In AB Suite 7.0, there is the new file stereotype. Again, all upgrades will convert files to use the new file stereotype. In this demonstration, you will see the addition of primitive types and the new file stereotype. When adding any types, it's best to add them to a dictionary. So let's create a dictionary and give it a suitable name. To this dictionary, I will add some primitive types to represent properties of an employee. Add a primitive for an address. I'll add another one to represent a phone number. For the phone number, we'll make it a number, length 10. For the address, we'll leave it as a string and we'll give it a length of 20. You'll notice that properties for a primitive don't include things like inherits, persistence. This is the most basic building block of Agile Business Suite, the primitive type. I'll also define now a file for potentially extracting employee records from this system. In the past, you would add a class that inherits from g or b.file, but now you just add a file stereotyped class. So I'll call this toDisk create. We defaulted to multiplicity 1, and to this class you would add a structure that represents your record layout. Thank you. That concludes this demonstration. Next, we're going to look at some enhancements to the model concepts. So strap yourselves in, because the next one's going to be big. The inherits property is no longer used for an attribute to derive its type. Instead, we have the template property. In AB Suite, there are two ways to define the type of an attribute, variable, or a parameter. There's still the self-defining technique where you just set the primitive, or the better technique is to derive the type from a class, primitive, or interface using the new template property. By using the template property, this allows you to maintain consistency by reusing the same objects and avoid simple mistakes such as truncation and accidental data coercion when passing data. The inherits property is now used for just defining subclass, superclass relationships between two classes. All attributes that used to inherit from their class will now be upgraded to template to that class. The logic for doing value checking during the iSpec cycle is now defined on the attribute and not on the class. On upgrade, all value checking logic will be propagated to the appropriate attributes within or in-out direction. The sequence number plays an important role when defining parameters, groups, and frames. When merging or importing, it's important to be aware of any conflicts, and for this reason, in AB Suite 7.0, we now report duplicates and gaps as an error for inspection and adjustment. There is a new resequence members option on the quick actions if you so choose to use the defaults to resolve these errors. For the advanced developer, defining a well-encapsulated class could not be easier than in Agile Business Suite 7.0. The isInner rule has been enhanced to allow a non-inner class to instantiate and access the structure of inner classes. In this demonstration, you will see how to use primitive types. To the segment, we'll add an iSpec to represent an employee. We'll add a couple of attributes for address and phone numbers. when adding an attribute, we encourage using types in your application. This is optional, but let's go and choose the address primitive type. Called home. And now let's go enter another attribute. Let's enter another address. We'll call it an office. And we'll also add a phone number. I'll go choose the phone primitive type. And press OK. So when we define an attribute, we don't use an inherits property. There is no inherits property on attributes anymore. You specify the type by using the template property. When using the template property, you need to specify a type. You cannot set the template property to another attribute. Let's have a look at that. So let's try and add an attribute for another address, and I will try to point it to the office attribute. Press Tab, and immediately you'll see that changes. As we can't template to other objects, we'll look at the object that you're trying to template to, find its type, and default to that. Call this postal. Press OK. That concludes this demonstration. Thank you. In this demonstration, we will explore classes and the inherits property. Let's add a couple of classes to represent some animals. As always, add a dictionary to hold your types. We'll call this dictionary zoo. Let's add our dog and cat classes. And we'll add another class that will represent a generalization of both dogs and cats. And we'll call that animals. To form the relationship to the base class, animal, we'll set the inherits property. And there we have our superclass and subclasses representing a zoo of animals. There are several ways to create an instance of these classes. There's an attribute, variable and parameter that templates to this class, but we still support the mechanism of setting the multiplicity of the class. So for the dog and the cat, we'll represent one instance of both by setting their multiplicity. In previous releases, this would have actually created two instances of animal, and the classes cat and dog would disappear from class view. But as you can see, the dog and the cat classes remain, and we have instances under our zoo representing dog and cat. So in Agile Business Suite 7.0, inherits only means generalization. It does not mean instantiation. Thank you. In this demonstration, we will have a look at the sequence number for attributes. To the animal class, I've already added a group with the details for all animals. With groups having a string representation, the sequence of these attributes is important. If I were to delete one of the attributes, a gap can occur in the sequence, which is an error now. I can either manually adjust the sequence numbers to suit my desired outcome, or if the sequence number is not that important to me because maybe I don't use string semantics for groups, I can quickly address the sequence issue through the quick actions resequence, and automatic sequence numbers will be given. Thank you. That concludes the demonstration. Let's move on to the user experience enhancements in AB Suite 7.0. You would have seen this dialog already in previous slides and demonstrations. It's the new Add New Attribute dialog. With its clever defaults, this dialog offers an easy way to create one-to-many attributes of your favorite class, primitive, or interface. There's also the multiplicity property if you wish to define an array. The logic editor can now detect the use of methods and attributes that aren't defined in the model, and through the quick action will allow you to create them. This example here shows the test method can be created with a return type of Boolean, and having analyzed the name attribute has decided to create a string as the first parameter. Our final topic in the user experience section is the Format All Logics option. When selected, the style as defined in the text editor properties will be applied to all logics in the model. A really good option to do before adding your model to source control. In this demonstration, we'll have a look at the new additions to the light bulb quick action in the editor. To our employee iSpec, let's add a main method. And to this main method, we'll write some new logic where we're going to perform a test on the mobile number, and then if it returns true, we will assign the mobile to a new attribute, landline. Now, as you can see, the squiggly lines show us that these two named elements don't exist in our model. In AB Suite 7.0, we now provide the ability to add these automatically through the light bulb create method. We can see from this information it's going to create it with a return variable of Boolean, and it's going to have a number being passed as a parameter. So let's create it, and the squiggly line will go away. We'll do the same thing for the landline. Now it knows by analyzing its place in the expression that this has to be a number and an attribute of the current object. So let's create landline automatically. This logic is now valid. Let's go and have a look at the members that were created. So not only did it know that the landline needed to be a number, but it also noticed that it needed to template from the phone, because the mobile templated from the phone. And the same goes for the test method. The parameter is also templated to the phone by default. And as said before, the return is a Boolean, as you can see here. Thank you. That concludes this demonstration. This now brings us to Debugger, which has undergone some significant enhancements in Agile Business Suite 7.0. The first place to start is with the start. There are now two ways to start an Agile Business Suite application. You can use the step in that breaks on the very first line, or you can just use the start that will continue until it hits the first breakpoint. When you do start, everything is automatically configured by default. The initial build is done, databases are created, and then the system will start. Obviously, after your first start, these things can be configured. To choose the mode of debugging, you select the object that you want to debug. If it's a public method of the segment, if it's a report or messenger, then select the object in class view and press start. For all other selections, the online will be started. Another great piece of news is that reports, when executed, will run in the current Visual Studio instance, making that debugger experience a lot faster. A new window that's been implemented in AB Suite 7.0 is the Debugger Immediate window, a full-on editor that allows you to evaluate expressions on the fly, as well as executing statements and printing variables. As in this example, you can see that the numbers array has been printed as one long string, as well as displaying all of its cells. In this demonstration, we'll debug a iSpec that runs a report. So let's start by stepping into the iSpec, so what we call step into, which will break on the very first line of LDL plus logic. Given the logic's in the main, we'll enter some data on the form, and we'll break immediately into the employee.main. The very first line is to run the report, which I'll step over and continue debugging the employee. If we have a look at the process window, we can see another process has started that is currently running the report. The results should come back soon. But as I'm not concerned about the report, I'll just continue debugging. Oh, and here are the results right now of that report. So let's close that down because that was running in parallel. I'll continue stepping. If we have another look at the process window, we can see that the report debugger process has gone away. And I can continue debugging the online. If I was interested in following the execution of the report, I would have to set a breakpoint in the report, main logic or frame logic. So let's demonstrate that. Let's enter a value into the form. So let's go over to the ePrint report, main logic, and let's set a breakpoint on the very first line. And we'll press continue. And here we are in the report. I can continue debugging the report, stepping into the header frame. We can see just moving a date, and there's a footer, and I just press continue. And there's the results of the report. Let's look at another scenario where there's a breakpoint in both the online and the report and what that looks like. So let's enter another value into the iSpec. And because I press pause, we're breaking into the first place that LDL plus is executed, which is the main method of the iSpec. And let's put a breakpoint here. So I have a breakpoint in the online as well as the report. And I'll press continue. Now, just before I press continue, let me explain something. That both processes will be running asynchronously. So it's whichever breakpoint is hit first, that's where things will stop. So I want to debug the report, which has a breakpoint still on the main method, but there's a breakpoint here as well. So let's press continue and see where it stops. Now, when the breakpoint has been hit, and we can see that it's the breakpoint here in the iSpec, the process has stopped in the report. So if I continue now, the next breakpoint that's going to be executed will be the one I'm interested in, which is in the report. So let's press continue. And here we go. Here we are back in the report again. And I will continue my debugging, stepping over the logic, doing my analysis, and then pressing continue. And there's the report output. So there we have it. Debugging with reports. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Goodbye.